Okay, so lots of people have actually been looking at this change in the way that we communicate because of the digital revolution. So here we've got um, what Barron said about this, and an awful lot of this again is taken from Language and Media, and they give quite a good overview. But there are also other texts to look at in the suggested reading and the further reading for this week. So Barron in Alphabet to Email talks about how we could actually look at this text and speech, or writing and speech, in different ways. So we could look at it as there being an opposition between the two forms, or that it's a continuum, that things are just evolving, or that we're having a crossover happening. So this is what they suggest is this opposition view. So we could say that writing is objective, whereas speech is interpersonal. Writing is a monologue, whereas speech is a dialogue. So, we've got all of those different types of opposing views of, writing is one type of thing, it's durable, scannable, planned, structured, and so on, whereas speech is ephemeral, spontaneous, loosely structured, concerned with the present, informal, and so on. So we could take that opposition view, and some writing is indeed a monologue, and the Queen's Speech, for example, is a monologue, and it is highly structured, it is syntactically complex, it is concerned with past and future, and so on. Whereas, although that's written down and it's supposed to be a speech, but it's not sort of speech between two people. So, it's in a very particular register, in a particular place, in a particular time. So, two people having a conversation is, of course, interpersonal, ephemeral, it's lost. Unless somebody records it, it is ephemeral, it has gone. We can, it's spontaneous, it's syntactically simple, it's concerned with the present, and so on. So, yes, we can look at the different types of communication of writing and talking. We can actually compare them in opposition with one another, but that's not the only way to look at speech and writing. We could also have this continuum view. So how these two forms perhaps are on a scale or a spectrum. So on the one hand, the far end of the spectrum, we have traditional writing and word processors, newspapers, and the script of a play. Very formal, very much stylized, they have particular registers, and so on. And then on the other end of that scale, the other end of that spectrum, we have face-to-face speech. That's the complete opposite of traditional writing. And we have with the materials, the tools, the medium. On the one end, we have word processors. And then on the other, with speech, we have teleconferencing. And we perhaps now could change that to Zoom or FaceTime. And then the forms of sort of mass communication, mass media, we have newspaper at one end, personal report on events at the other, and in the middle there, television news. And then the last one, we could have at one end the traditional written form, script of a play, and on the other end of that spectrum, a phone conversation. So it's possible to have a continuum where, as I say, it's like a spectrum, and we can actually slot in different formats within those sort of extremes of writing and speech. So, it's quite possible to look at things in that way too. Or we might actually decide to take this crossover view, and certainly that's something that we saw from last week, that John B. Thompson, he takes very much a crossover view on some things and sort of suggests that there are things that cross over. So as it says, a linguistic message may be experienced or transmitted in a medium other than the one for which it was intended, so spoken versus written. So an example of this would be something like blogging. So that's interpersonal. That can be a dialogue because we have comments. It'll be loosely structured and so on and so forth. So, you know, there are some things that cross over. And I would suggest that there are an awful lot more things that we see with a crossover these days because of the explosion in digital media. That has meant that we are more likely to use spoken forms as written forms. And it's something that if we're going to write about this, particularly in essays, we need to be extremely careful about, because and I have to sort of put my hands up here and admit that, you know, I'm quite bad at maintaining the correct register when I'm writing formally, because I used to be a journalist and, you know, I've got sort of years of blogging and writing quite informally. I find it hard to focus down and make sure that I am maintaining an academic register when I'm writing academically. So, yeah, try to not fall into that same trap when you're writing essays. So don't use contractions, you know, so you can't say, here's this thing, you know, with the contraction of here is to here's. You know, you need to avoid that type of thing, and you need to use a far more formal register. And as I say, you know, I still have trouble with it because my natural inclination is to write something that is absolutely rooted in the digital world and is far more interpersonal, loosely structured, and so on. So, yeah, be careful of that. Now, some of the suggested reading for this week includes some quotes from Halliday. So Halliday, we might think, well, you know, that's really quite dated. It's from 1978. But what Halliday says about register and style is quite useful. So Halliday identifies these different elements. So he says field. So this field, this is all about the context. It's the purpose or role for which the language is being used, which typically derives from the field in which it's being used, its subject matter. So we might use the phrase semantic field. And, you know, of course, that means that we're using words that all fit into a particular set, if you like. So, you know, if we're going to use a semantic field of weather, for example, we might say that this person was of a sunny disposition, or that I can't think of anything now, or they were perhaps a stormy person because they like to have arguments, you know. So we could have a whole piece written drawing upon a particular semantic field. And that's something that we see quite commonly in poetry, but not just poetry. You know, if we're using a particular register, a legal register, for example, then, or a medical register, we are going to call upon particular terminology, particular words that underline this is the context, this is the field that we are writing about. And Halliday also says that mode is important. So what medium is being used? Is it handwritten? Is it printed on a page? Is it appearing on a screen? Is it a telephone conversation? You know, all of those things that we were looking at last week. What particular mode is this in? What is the medium that's being used? And as we'll see as the term goes on, when we start to look at things like multimodal, we're seeing in an awful lot of digital communication where we have got multiple different modes being used. We have the mode of text alongside the mode of image, and both of these things are communicating the same story and perhaps different elements of it. So we do need to consider that particular mode and what that means and what that communicates. And if you had a look at the video or you read the text of Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message, you'll know that the particular mode, the particular medium, tells us a huge amount, and is important in its own right. And somebody using, for example, very famously a few decades ago, the singer and actor Phil Collins famously dumped his wife via a fax message. And this is something also that we've heard stories, and hopefully none of us have ever done this, of breaking up with somebody over a text message, on the phone. So these forms are, they tell us something about the time, but they also tell us something about the person. It's really not a kind thing to do, to dump somebody via a fax message. And of course, now it's almost impossible anyway, because nobody has fax machines. But, it's not a kind thing to do, to dump somebody via text message. But that tells us something. It tells us something about the person, the producer of that message. And it tells us perhaps less about the receiver, the audience, but we can certainly imagine how the audience, the receiver, felt. And then finally, the other thing that Halliday also talks about is this notion of tenor. And that, as it says, is about social roles. So those social roles prescribed for or adopted by participants in the communication situation, which determines tone. So we could say that the tenor of this lecture is that the social role that I have taken on here is that of lecturer. And the social role that you, the listener, have taken on is not just of listener but of student. So these are social roles, and that they do not completely define us. We have multiple different social roles, and depending on which particular role we are playing at a particular time, then dictates the type of tenor, the tone that we would use. So, I wouldn't talk to my close friends in the same way that I'm talking now in this lecture recording, for example. So because I would be in a different social role. So yeah, tenor then determines tone. So we do need to think about all of those different elements, and Halliday can be quite useful for helping us to unpick that. So I'm not going to play this, but that YouTube link works. So by all means, watch that. These slides are of course available on Moodle separately, without any voiceover. But if you look at Barack Obama's victory speech, you will see that there is, there's a certain register going on, but also in an awful lot of Obama's speeches, there is a particular tone, a particular clarity. And an awful lot of that comes out of who he is, his sort of socially adopted roles. And remember that before he went into politics, he was a law professor. So, this is a man who is extremely familiar with a very formal register, a legal register, and is used to speaking in public to large groups with clarity. And we could, of course, compare this to the current President of the United States, Donald Trump, who, his background, of course, is that he is a property developer and sort of property mogul, if you like. That's where he's made his money. But more recently, he is known for being a reality TV star. So he was a celebrity, a reality television celebrity. And that, of course, has meant that the way that he speaks in speeches tends to be considerably more informal. And we could perhaps argue that because he has a background in television, popular television, that means that he continually uses a register and a tone, a style that is easily relatable to people, the general public, who are very familiar with reality TV shows. So this is one of the reasons perhaps why people in America and around the world have said, well, this is a man who speaks the same language as us. Whereas Barack Obama, with his far more legalistic, more formal register, may have actually alienated some listeners who perhaps felt, well, this is far too formal and too legal a register and so on. This is not something that I am familiar with. It's not part of my everyday usage, and therefore I perhaps don't understand it or don't want to understand it, because it's not as easy and straightforward as the way in which Donald Trump commonly speaks. And that's aside from, the criticism that's been levelled regularly at Donald Trump about him using incomplete sentences, not necessarily making sense, not being logical, and the phrase that's often bandied about with Donald Trump is that he just produces word salad, and Barack Obama didn't. He used complete sentences and was, as I say, very logical and so on. But we do need to consider what their social roles were before they became president, and how perhaps that actually added to their gaining of votes or gaining of popularity. And do remember who was president before Barack Obama, and it was George W. Bush, who was not known for being a particularly good public speaker. And he's not particularly known for being, shall we say, an intellectual heavyweight. So it wasn't surprising that when Barack Obama came along, by comparison, he appeared to be far more logical, in control, intelligent, and so on. But of course, then, the pendulum has swung the other way, and America got Donald Trump. Yes, there are other elements going on in there, not least of all race. And the fact that Donald Trump, of course, wasn't running against Barack Obama, but instead Hillary Clinton. So, of course, gender came into it as well, and, lots of other different things. But do consider the style, their register, the tenor, all of those things. Consider how that affects the way that we view not just, of course, American politicians, but how we also view British politicians and their popularity. And, whether we are dealing with our current Prime Minister, who of course was a journalist and again television celebrity, compared to the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, whose background is that of a QC, so he was a judge and worked as a human rights lawyer and barrister. So, compare again the legal register compared to a journalistic register, and what that means, and how that all then plays into people's opinions. So let's finally sum up there. So register and style is extremely important, because whether we notice it or not, and of course most of the time the general public doesn't notice register and style overtly, but when we begin to actually analyse differences in how language is presented, where it comes from, when was it written or said, what is being discussed, think about, how this tells you more about the register and style that's being used, and then, what that makes us believe, to think, what is being communicated to us. What is the author trying to say, and what is the audience understanding from the way that it's been said according to that register and style. And if you decide to write about this particular one, definitely, if you're looking for examples, which you'd need to for the essay question, find examples that you can explain. So, and don't be afraid to really unpick them, and to look at things like, the medium that this particular communication appears in, and all of those different elements of register and style. And of course, what happens when we have a mismatch in register and style and the context that's being used. What happens then? And if you've looked at the videos, you'll know that there's at least one there, the RAF pilots, the comedy one from Armstrong and Miller, which has a complete mismatch of context and what we would anticipate, and then the register and style that they're actually using. How it absolutely doesn't match, and then what that does. Anyway, we can discuss this more in the seminars, so I will see you next week.